fostering deeper relationships, influencing behavior change, developing resilience. You're about to start winning. Here is your host, Christine Bright.
Welcome to Parenting Game. We are in our second episode on the discussion of bullying. And we need to remember that bullying isn't just something that happens on the playground between our kids. It can happen in any social environment, and it affects our community. Today, again, I have Winona Brewster, who is the chair of programming for ABC, the Anti-Bullying Collaborative of Sun Prairie. And today we're going to be discussing a little bit of the brain science and how we know that bullying affects children, and then our childhood bullying can also affect our adult life. So you and I, Winona, can geek out on this all day long.
That's
We
true.
love talking about the brain science. And I know sometimes when people think about it, it's like, ugh, we're going to be learning about brain science. This is going to be overwhelming. It's going to
be like rocket science.
Yes, and it's going to be a lot of big words, and I'm not going to understand it. But that is not the case. And it is important for parents and people in the community to understand the brain science behind it. So we are now more aware and more attentive that this is an issue that needs to be looked at instead of something that we just dismiss and it'll be fine and people will get over it, because the research is showing that is not the case.
That's right, yes.
So we know that these experiences in childhood of bullying or traumatic experiences, if they are not addressed and resolved in childhood, they can definitely carry over into adulthood. So share with us what the research is showing.
Sure, I want to thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to discuss this. Not only do I geek out on it, it's what I do. It's the work I do professionally.
Yes.
And so the things I'm going to discuss today, and I do have my computer in front of me because I want to make sure I'm as accurate as possible in this discussion.
Yes.
It's not like I don't know this stuff, but
Yeah.
I want to make sure I communicate it. So the work I'm presenting today is based on the work that I've done for almost 12 years as the Senior Director of Child Brain Development for the Illinois chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it is based on science. It is evidence-based. That means we've done, as you mentioned, a lot of research behind this work. And what the research tells us is that our healthy development in the earliest years means that children will be more successful in school, but not just in school, in life generally. And we do want our kids to be successful, unless we've been so brain damaged that we don't. But we do want to have those measures of success. And as adults, we know that if kids have grown up with these positive experiences, that they'll be more productive contributors to the economy, more responsible citizens, which I always think is important, and just generally lead healthier and longer lives. We'll be talking about the longer piece in just a minute. So we know that when children grow up and they have had healthy brain development, as adults, the communities they live in will be stronger. The economy they participate in will be healthier. They'll enjoy more positive relationships, which is something I think we would all really appreciate. And they'll be better parents for the next generation of children. So when we're talking about this, we can see that it isn't just about what happens with individual children or children within a family, but how society as a whole benefits from children growing up healthy. And we talk about physical health, but we're also talking about brain health. So it's also true that children are subjected to what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Sometimes people will hear that phrase. Earlier in life, without helpful interventions, then as adults, they will face negative health outcomes, increased negative personal and professional relationships. And I ask people to think about maybe that partner that they've had, or that boss that they've had, or that person they've had to manage, and they just can't seem to make it work, or they just watch a lot of high-risk behaviors. Quite often, that is directly related to what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, I think what would be helpful for parents and those watching is, defining what an adverse childhood experiences. Now, we've been discussing bullying. So, of course, being bullied is one of those experiences, but can you give more examples and define that?
Sure. Adverse childhood experience really encompass a variety of forms of both physical and emotional abuse, if they're adverse. Maybe neglect, maybe the household dysfunction is present, and it's all experienced in childhood. And what the research tells us is that these experiences have been linked to premature death, which is something we always want to pay attention to, as well as a lot of the negative health outcomes and problematic social behaviors, such as bullying, and could include mental disorders, anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. So there has been actual research on adverse childhood experiences. There is a long-term study that was done, and just to talk about the study would take up most of the show.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. But this is real research that we're talking about that indicated that there are a series of basically 10 experiences that somebody can have as a child. And if they have them between the ages of just after birth to about 4 years of age, and there is no helpful intervention, that they can negatively impact the children. And they are experiences that you might think of very commonly. Of course, we think. I worked in juvenile court for 4 years working with kids who had been abused and neglected. So we always think abuse and neglect. Those are probably obvious kinds of things. But in addition to that, the other experiences include having parents who are substance abusers, having parents who have mental health issues in their own lives, and they're struggling with that and trying to raise a family. Poverty can impact a child in many negative ways, but it can be part of an adverse childhood experience because it yields issues about hunger, housing, lack of safety in housing, etc. I think not if I had to sum it up, I will sum it up. What we look at when we look at adverse childhood experiences, the bottom line is in all of those situations, the common denominator, and this is so very important, the common denominator is the lack of a responsible, safe, reliable human being offering any kind of intervention with the child.
And I think that has always been so profound to me that, it just takes one. I mean, that just blows the doors off for, why mentor? Can I influence, just me, this child that may have other things going on? And yes, the research proves that if you can be that stable person in their lives, you can really change their outcomes. Right. And that's such good news too, because we hear so much and we're just like, oh, how, what can I do? And we hear so many of the negative things, happening in the media and TV. And I know, I've sat there, I know my friend sat there and just like, what do we do? And here it is. Be that one stable person, in that child's life. Or, for a parent that may just feel like there's other negative influences from the other parent, this is your hope to continue to be stable for them, because it will totally change the outcomes for them.
And it can be a parent, it can be a grandparent.
Yes.
I'm a big proponent of grandparents getting their business
and I can
everything.
testify, you are like the coolest, most involved grandparent. I love it.
If my grandkids said that, that would mean something. Thank you.
It's just like, can we talk today? No, I have to go to baseball. Fine.
So grandparents can do that. In the professional work that I do, I work with a lot of educators as just one example. But when we work with educators, we aren't doing it just with the teachers. We have these conversations with what, when I was a kid, we call the lunchroom lady, the bus driver, the transportation specialist, the maintenance people, etc. The clerk, the receptionist in a school often knows more about what's going on with kids than anybody else does. And for that person to say the kid's name, to say, I'm glad you're here today, to say, I think you can do that, that can make all the difference for a child. And so when we talk about being that person in somebody's life, it doesn't always take a lot of extra time or energy. In many cases, it takes doing what we do and remembering the intentionality behind it with young kids in
Well, I'm glad you
particular.
said that word, because that's exactly what I was going to say.
Intentionality?
Being intentional,
Yes.
right? Because we can do a lot of stuff, and if we're not intentional with it, it's not going to have the results that we want. But taking that moment to be intent, look them in the eye, say their name, those small, what we say are small,
But they're not.
but are intentional,
Yeah.
reap big rewards.
Yeah, yeah.
So a little bit more about, so we know these adverse childhood experiences, have detriment on childhood.
Mm-hmm.
But share a little bit then how that leaps over then into adulthood. We talked about.
Sure. Now we're talking about more of the science of it, because this is related not just to brain development, but brain function and brain chemistry. And for many people, as soon as you say development, chemistry, etc., they start to shut down. So I'm not going to go into all of the minutiae about that. That only seems to interest me and one of my granddaughters and a couple of brain development people that I work with. But the reality is there are parts of our brain when we experience at any age, and think about it in adulthood even, when we experience at any age certain kinds of behaviors from other people that sort of leave us raw, leave us feeling yucky, leave us feeling as though we're not cared for, cared about. In our brain, in order to protect ourselves, because that's the first thing the brain does, chemistry flows through the brain that basically shuts down some of our emotional parts so we don't end up feeling all that negative stuff all the time because we think that's all we're getting hit with. But in the process of doing that, our brain doesn't stop, so we start having other behaviors. We end up, because our brain shut down in certain emotional places, not trusting ourselves as children, trusting our instincts. People try to talk kids out of their emotions all the time.
Oh, this is a conversation I have with a lot of parents. Validate what your kids are feeling.
And if that doesn't happen, then the kids, because this is what kids do, they blame themselves. And they take that behavior right there into adulthood. How many adults, and I will say I observe it about adults who are females all the time, are saying, I'm sorry, it's, I don't like that, had nothing to do with it.
I have a couple girlfriends, and we don't actually do it, but
wish you had a nickel
Yeah, we
jar.
make like little bets, like, oh, I wonder how many times she's going to say sorry today. But in a way of, again, owning it and encouraging each other in that, we've brought that forward.
Right,
It isn't necessarily a
exactly.
healthy thing.
Exactly. And not only have we brought that forward, the feeling that somehow we must be responsible. Even though when you're a kid, you just don't have that kind of power. But first of all,
Yes.
people are willing to let you feel that way. But also then, if we don't trust ourselves and our instincts, we become hypervigilant. This is behavior that goes into adulthood, and we see it all the time. And you might see it in people you manage or who manage you, where they just can't back off. Every move you make, what is that about? What are you doing? And it isn't because they've had some secret sauce that they've used to become better managers. We know that doesn't make you a better manager. It's because of their own hypervigilance. What they're really doing is trying to read you, like, here's what you're doing to me right now. You're giving me helpful feedback by nodding. If I grew up in a home where it was a blank slate, and there's a whole bunch of research on putting babies in front of moms. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have. That
It's
is like
heartbreaking.
painful to watch.
Yeah, it was painful for
it's
the moms
important
to do.
know. Yeah.
If they don't get that kind of feedback, the positive feedback, they start trying harder to make that
Yes.
happen. Or if all they get is negative feedback, they shut down because they can't trust that what they're doing is right. They're taking their judgment from somebody else. That's why that positive nodding, as simple as it is such a good example. And
Yeah.
we look for it in adulthood. I work with a lot of people, and boy, I always am grateful when I see at least one person who's going, oh yeah. Like
Well,
that.
even with coaching, I'm reading
Yes.
the parents,
Yes.
and it's interesting. It's typical that usually one is writing like the Mad Hatter, and the other one is this, kind of sitting there, and I'm like going, are they taking anything in?
Yeah.
But yeah, we look for those cues, and they're important.
Yeah. And so this behavior that we learn and take on, if nobody has done healthy interventions or helpful interventions with us when we're younger, and for myself, I grew up in a home, both my parents, every kid will say, my parents have issues. My parents did, and none of those issues were things they brought on themselves. But I couldn't make meaning out of things that were happening until I was an adult and learned about these behaviors and had somebody who was a professional help me process them. But without growing up with that, I always felt as though I need to do something to make my mom happier or my dad smile or something like that. If we don't have those helpful interventions, we take that into our adulthood. We take that into our adulthood in terms of this is the way we're going to be in the world. I won't be able to trust my spouse because they are not always giving me positive feedback all the time, and anything I do wrong, it must be the end of the world. Feels like a catastrophe, even though that is not necessarily what the spouse was thinking about at all. We see where we have managers who don't acknowledge the value of our work, where we have teachers who don't acknowledge the value of what we do in many places in our lives. And we can be those people too. We can be the person who says, I don't want to, I hear parents say a lot, I don't want to compliment them. It might go to their heads. Now, this is what we have been told.
Yeah.
This isn't like something unique. Well, it doesn't go to their heads in a negative way. It might go to their heads, but not in a negative way.
Yeah.
And just that positive reinforcement. If we don't get that when we're younger in some way, we're always looking for it. We're always trying to read for it. We will glom onto all kinds of relationships where we think that's what we're going to get. Then we can't figure out why the relationships fail. Because we didn't happen to mention to that person, this is what I'm expecting of you.
Yes.
Because we often don't even know that.
Well,
So-
and then you had shared too that, in the medical field, they're
Yes.
making this movement now from, and I like the words that you used, is what's wrong with you to what happened to you.
Yes.
Delve into that a little
Yes.
bit more.
When we look at how if you look through the lens of the medical community, everything that the medical community learns is to diagnose something because it's a problem. They don't spend a lot of time diagnosing people who come in and everything's okay, and all the charts say everything's okay. But when there's a problem, that's how people are approached. They're approached as an object, sometimes a human being, that's come there because there's a problem. Therefore, something's wrong, and something's wrong with them. The problem with that is that then we start to go into all the clinical testing. We do many of us have been through it, the blood tests, the x-rays, etc. And when we can't figure it out, then it must be something wrong in their head, right? Women have been subjected to that for years, just traditionally. The African American community has been subjected to that. The reality is that the shift in practice, again, whether it's the medical community, the education community, the legal community, law enforcement, to move away from what's wrong with this person that's making them bad to what in the world has happened to somebody, that this is the way they engage in the world. And you could even feel when you process it, the difference between judging people
Yep.
and finding that place in ourselves so we can empathize or open up ourselves enough to look beyond the immediate behavior in front of us to what we really need to work on.
And I do want to make this an important, segue. Again, we're not looking to not hold people accountable for their
Not at all.
behavior with this. It's an understanding of some of those whys, but we're not using this as an excuse, but that hope of how can that person become better. If you just look at them as bad, then the hope is gone. If you open that door, that what happened to you, yes, you're still accountable for your behavior, but now we can put in intervention so that behavior doesn't continue.
And the way we put in that intervention is not disciplining a bad person or punishing a bad person. That intervention is twofold. One, helping somebody to understand themselves why they do some of the things that they do. Helping ourselves to understand, but helping them to understand, because that's what will help to change the behavior.
Yes.
And then you talk about interventions that will work, and you don't make them up yourself. You start to have conversations with somebody about what will be helpful. Really successful marriage counseling, and I go to that because that's a relationship if people think they understand. My experience has been we don't have a clue sometimes, but we think we understand. But that's a relationship where there's a societal expectation you're going to do things to make it work. And so one of those things we do sometimes is go for counseling. And counselors all the time get this list of bad things this person did or bad things that person did, et cetera. And we have to move from that to try to understanding the behaviors and how people respond to each other. And there are whole case studies about that. So, but it does start in childhood.
Yeah.
Nobody comes out of a perfect childhood and has these kinds of behaviors. Now we're going to talk next segment about resilience. But resilience is an important piece of why things don't happen that way. So, and I don't want to overstep.
Yeah, as I said, there's so much to unpack, and it's all interwoven. And, we're learning, too, that, these adverse experiences that happen in childhood,
yes,
and then they're being carried over into adulthood, that not only are we talking about mental health, but there is a great impact on physical health
yes,
as well. So share with us, too, what the research has been showing in that.
And this can be discouraging for people on some level. And so what I'm about to say is not universally true of everybody who has heart disease or is a diabetic or gets cancer. But what we have learned is that some of the high-risk behaviors that can lead to heart disease and obesity, such as smoking, substance abuse, etc., those are the things that can build physically in our systems to come to the point of leading to physical illness. I think examples I can think of. So high-risk behaviors are behaviors that we use to manage stress. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Kids use them, adults use them. They use all kinds of behaviors, but the high-risk behaviors are the ones that will seem to soothe the immediate stress, but they don't work long-term. And sometimes the high-risk behavior has to do with the kind of relationships people are in. Some really interesting research that I worked on when I was in Illinois with the Department of DCFS about why so many young women in DCFS care were getting pregnant and then rebirthing within 3 years. And by the time they were 16, had 2 children. And so DCFS was saying birth control, birth control, birth control. Clearly it wasn't the lack of birth control. So you have to drill down into what was the behavior that was going on there and help people to recognize it. And it is not loose behavior. Mm-hmm. It's not that they have no moral. I mean, that's
yes.
So with people who are substance abusers, if they were only more strong-willed, people
more disciplined, more
right,
yes.
exactly. And it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with immediate management of stress. And why we have to learn to manage our stress in healthy ways is we'll go down that route otherwise. So it's the immediate management of stress, but it doesn't work long term. And long term can be as much as 15 minutes. Smoking a cigarette might calm me down in the moment, but it may not be what I need.
So, so as we know, as these, experiences, whenever we experience them in childhood, adulthood, or they're being dragged along, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about physical health. Now, there are some other, factors here in play that affect these adverse child experiences. And we're talking about social and cultural issues. Yeah. I would really love for you to explain what that looks like.
Sure. One of the things that you'll hear this kind of phrase more often than when we used to hear it, and that phrase is zip code matters more than genetic code when we're looking at these issues with kids. So the social and cultural pieces have a lot to do with, so I'm from Chicago and worked on the south side and the west side, which are notorious for having really high negative health outcomes. The lack of healthy food, with food islands, or food deserts, they're food deserts all over the place. That means there's no place to get healthy food. That's the first piece. You go into the liquor store, and maybe they've got a refrigerator in the back, and you can get some cheese or something like that, maybe milk. That's not a common thing. They have no safe places for the kids to go outside and play. The trauma that kids in places like Chicago face in terms of the gunshots they hear every single day, it's just part of their lives, is very real. That's why looking at that zip code becomes important. If you don't have good transportation, even though it's a place like Chicago, you still can't get to a job. If you don't have enough education, you may not find that job. If you don't have a safe way to get to school, school might be great, public library might be great, the park might be great, but getting there is dangerous. And those are sort of the social kinds of things. The other thing that we've observed that to me is interesting, because I'm the oldest child in my family of 5 kids, is that birth order does have something to do with how we engage in the world. And it doesn't take me too long to figure out if you're the oldest daughter in a family, etc. Not because I'm so brilliant, I'd like to think that's it, but that's not it. The behaviors show themselves in terms of how you take responsibility, etc. But children, very early in life, learn what their role is, not just where they are in terms of birth order, but what their role is. Are they the kid who helps make mom smile because she's depressed a lot, but when they come by, they know how to do the cutesy things, so they carry that into their adult life, and that's the role they know to have. Are they the child who is, because mom and dad have mental health issues and are not emotionally available, even if they're physically available, are they the kid who ends up taking charge, making sure that their brothers and sisters get fed, get dressed for school, do their homework, etc., the in-charge kid? They take that into their adult life. Now, that can work in our favor, depending on what we do in our adult lives, but it can be really damaging to relationships where the person that you're involved with doesn't expect you to be that way and doesn't want to be something different just so you can be that way. So that's one of the ways we notice it the most. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's important for people, to know that all those pieces that come into play, especially now if you're moving into adulthood and you're seeing some things that you want to repair. As parents, it's important for us to know so, we can start maybe mitigating some things that we haven't noticed, or you see a behavior in your child and you're like, I don't quite understand where that's coming from.
Or better than that, you see a behavior in yourself that the child might be picking up.
Yes. For me, it was. My anger is something I brought into my adult life from my parents, and then I saw my son do it, and that's click for me. I'm like, nope, we are not going to, carry this on. But as always, there's so much to talk about and we start running out of time. But I really don't want to leave this, bring the hope back into it. So we know how these relationships can affect us, adversely, and, how that's going to carry on. But good relationships too. So tell us why these good, healthy relationships matter so much.
And I try to always end these conversations about all these fun topics that I train on, trauma, toxic stress, child abuse, etc., with the idea that there is good news. And that good news really is what you just referenced, whether it comes to looking at issues of building resilience, brain development, social emotional learning, things that we are hearing more about, that we're more aware of, certainly in a community like Sun Prairie. And that good news is that anybody, I think there are 2 pieces. One is what a friend of mine who's the president of the Illinois chapter says a lot, and Mary Dobbins, if you're listening, I credit you with this. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. She's a child brain development specialist who's also a child psychiatrist. One of 6 in Illinois who will take on Medicare kids. So she's busy a lot. But you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We can find ways to work with kids and with adults to help ourselves, if nothing else, manage their behavior, tolerate their behavior, but probably help them. But the other is anybody can be, you don't have to be really well trained either as a therapist or an educator, etc., to be that person who can be that positive influence. And it doesn't have to be all the time. Sometimes when I talk to people, they'll tell me the story of that one teacher who they only had for a few weeks, or that person they met in Sunday school who they only engaged with a little bit, but it made such a difference in their lives in a positive way. And we need to pay attention to that. We also need to be willing to pay attention to that for ourselves, not only finding those people, but looking for opportunities. Hey, that kid probably just, if I say be hugged, then we've got all the legal issues, but needs some positive attention.
I mean,
and it isn't going to hurt them.
the words
matter
yes.
so much.
To bring this back to what ABC is doing and the bullying, the reason we talked about the brain science is because we need people to be aware that you can't dismiss this. You can't dismiss this bullying because it is going to affect that child, and it could carry on into their adult life. And this is why it's a community problem, and why you guys are so passionate, about what you're doing. Is that we want healthy communities, and we have to understand that this is a big deal. It isn't just teasing, which we typically put it to. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for inviting
everything
me.
that
I really
you
appreciate the opportunity to talk about all these fun topics.
I know, and as I said, you and I can talk about this forever.
And we have.
We've had some long conversations. Yes. I want to thank you for tuning in, and remember, time invested in a child is never wasted.
Thank you for watching The Parenting Game. All episodes of The Parenting Game are available on demand at sunprairiemediacenter.com.